Tiberius, Part III. Of the Lives of the 12 Caesars, by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lives of the 12 Caesars, by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Translated by Alexander Thompson and edited by T. Forrester. Tiberius, Part III. But above all things he was careful to keep the public peace against robbers, burglars, and those who were disaffected to the government. He therefore increased the number of military stations throughout Italy, and formed a camp at Rome for the praetorian cohorts, which till then had been quartered in the city. He suppressed with great severity all tumults of the people on their first breaking out, and took every precaution to prevent them. Some persons having been killed in a quarrel which happened in the theatre, he banished the leaders of the parties and the players about whom the disturbance had arisen, nor could all the entreaties of the people afterwards prevail upon him to recall them. The people of Pollentia having refused to permit the removal of the corpse of a centurion of the first rank from the forum, until they had extorted from his heirs a sum of money for a public exhibition of gladiators, he detached a cohort from the city and another from the kingdom of Cottius, who, concealing the cause of their march, entered the town by different gates, with their arms suddenly displayed and trumpets sounding, and having seized the greatest part of the people and the magistrates, they were imprisoned for life. He abolished everywhere the privileges of all places of refuge. The Cyzicensians having committed an outrage upon some Romans, he deprived them of the liberty they had obtained for their good services in the Mithridatic war. Disturbances from foreign enemies he quelled by his lieutenants, without ever going against them in person, nor would he even employ his lieutenants, but with much reluctance, and when it was absolutely necessary. Princes who were ill affected towards him he kept in subjection, more by menaces and remonstrances than by force of arms. Some whom he induced to come to him by fair words and promises, he never would permit to return home, as Marabodus the German, Thrascypolis the Thracian, and Archelaus the Cappadocian, whose kingdom he even reduced into the form of a province. He never set foot outside the gates of Rome for 2 years together, from the time he assumed the supreme power, and after that period went no farther from the city than to some of the neighboring towns, his farthest excursion being to Antium, and that but very seldom and for a few days, though he often gave out that he would visit the provinces and armies, and made preparations for it almost every year, but taking up carriages and ordering provisions for his retinue in the municipia and colonies. At last he suffered vows to be put up for his good journey and safe return, insomuch that he was called jocosely by the name of Callipides, who is famous in a Greek proverb for being in a great hurry to go forward, but without ever advancing a cubit. But after the loss of his 2 sons, of whom Germanicus died in Syria and Drusus at Rome, he withdrew into Campania, at which time opinion and conversation were almost general that he never would return and would die soon. And both nearly turned out to be true, for indeed he never more came back to Rome, and a few days after leaving it, when he was at a villa of his called the Cave, near Terracina, during supper a great many huge stones fell from above, which killed several of the guests and attendants, but he almost hopelessly escaped. After he had gone round Campania and dedicated the capital of Capua and a temple to Augustus at Nola, which he made the pretext of his journey, he retired to Capri, being greatly delighted with the island, because it was accessible only by a narrow beach, being on all sides surrounded with rugged cliffs of a stupendous height, and by a deep sea. But immediately the people of Rome being extremely clamorous for his return, on account of a disaster at Fidenae, where upwards of 20,000 persons had been killed by the fall of the amphitheatre, during a public spectacle of gladiators, he crossed over again to the continent, and gave all people free access to him, so much the more because, at his departure from the city, he had caused it to be proclaimed that no one should address him, and he declined admitting any persons to his presence on the journey. Returning to the island, he so far abandoned all care of the government that he never filled up the decuriae of the knights, never changed any military tribunes or prefects, or governors of provinces, and kept Spain and Syria for several years without any consular lieutenants. He likewise suffered Armenia to be seized by the Parthians, Moesia by the Dacians and Sarmatians, and Gaul to be ravaged by the Germans, to the great disgrace and no less danger of the empire. But having now the advantage of privacy, and being remote from the observation of the people of Rome, he abandoned himself to all the vicious propensities which he had long but imperfectly concealed, and of which I shall here give a particular account from the beginning. While a young soldier in the camp, he was so remarkable for his excessive inclination to wine, that for Tiberius they called him Biberius, for Claudius Caldius, and for Nero Mero. And after he succeeded to the empire, and was invested with the office of reforming the morality of the people, he spent a whole night and 2 days together in feasting and drinking with Pomponius Flaccus and Lucius Piso, to one of whom he immediately gave the province of Syria, and to the other the prefecture of the city, declaring them, in his letters patent, to be very pleasant companions and friends fit for all occasions. He made an appointment to sup with Sestius Gallus, a lewd and prodigal old fellow, who had been disgraced by Augustus and reprimanded by himself but a few days before in the Senate House, upon condition that he should not recede in the least from his usual method of entertainment, and that they should be attended at table by naked girls. He preferred a very obscure candidate for the quaestorship before the most noble competitors, only for taking off, in pledging him at table, an amphora of wine at a draught. He presented Assellius Sabinus with 200,000 sesterces for writing a dialogue in the way of dispute betwixt the truffle and the fig pecker, the oyster and the thrush. He likewise instituted a new office to administer to his voluptuousness, to which he appointed Titus Caesonius Priscus, a Roman knight. In his retreat at Capri he also contrived an apartment containing couches, and adapted to the secret practice of abominable lewdness, where he entertained companies of girls and catamites, and assembled from all quarters inventors of unnatural copulations, whom he called Spintriae, who defiled one another in his presence, to inflame by the exhibition the languid appetite. He had several chambers set round with pictures and statues, in the most lascivious attitudes, and furnished with the books of Elephantis, that none might want a pattern for the execution of any lewd project that was prescribed him. He likewise contrived recesses in woods and groves for the gratification of lust, where young persons of both sexes prostituted themselves in caves and hollow rocks, in the disguise of little pans and nymphs. So that he was publicly and commonly called, by an abuse of the name of the island, Caprineus. But he was still more infamous if possible for an abomination not fit to be mentioned or heard, much less credited. When a picture painted by Parrhasius, in which the artist had represented Atalanta in the act of submitting to Meleager's lust in a most unnatural way, was bequeathed to him, with this proviso, that if the subject was offensive to him, he might receive in lieu of it 1,000,000 of sesterces, he not only chose the picture, but hung it up in his bedchamber. It's also reported that, during a sacrifice, he was so captivated with the form of a youth who held a censer, that before the religious rites were well over, he took him aside and abused him, as also a brother of his who had been playing the flute, and soon afterwards broke the legs of both of them, for upbraiding one another with their shame. How much he was guilty of a most foul intercourse with women even of the first quality, appeared very plainly by the death of one Mallonia, who, being brought to his bed, but resolutely refusing to comply with his lust, he gave her up to the common informers. Even when she was upon her trial, he frequently called out to her and asked her,